Well, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Conscious Change Agent Web Show. I'm your host, Jack Butler, and the Conscious Change Agent Web Show is where we bring you agents of conscious change, people who are doing the inner work whilst also making a real difference in the wider world. One such person, and my guest today, is Dr. Bert Parley. Bert is a licensed clinical psychologist with psychotherapy, coaching, and consultation practices out of Dallas, Texas. He was a founding member, lead trainer, and for several years chief of staff for Ken Wilber's Integral Institute here in Colorado. He's a senior advisor and executive coach for Stagen Leadership Institute in Dallas. His teaching posts include the Mendoza College of Business MBA program for executive education for the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. He holds a BA in political science from New Brunswick, an MA in contemplative psychotherapy from Naropa, and a doctorate in clinical psychology from the Californian Institute of Integral Studies. He's also a Canadian who knows a bit about ice hockey and has tried to be teaching me the rules. So, Bert, great to have you on the show.
Good to be with you, Limey.
So, you've been in the human development space for 30 plus years, maybe longer. What got you interested in all that? Take us back.
I took a wrong turn in Bangkok, is how this all began, truly. In high school, I talked to a couple of my best friends after high school to travel to North Africa and Europe and reprise a lot of the places and the adventures half a dozen young people had that hooked up together. And we went to Marrakesh and ran with the bulls and all that silliness right after high school. And I got a real taste for travel. And made a commitment at that point that when I finished college, I would go around the world by myself as a learning adventure. One night in a Bangkok hotel room, I reconnected with a friend I'd been traveling with in Indonesia, a German woman, and she had connected with an American man from San Diego. I was 25 at the time, and this was a man in his early 40s. He played a really nice mandolin, and we were all sitting around in Bangkok. He was going to tell her about a meditation course she was very interested in after our kind of music session. So I went with him and her, and he explained his experiences in this Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Nepal. And for me, as someone who had been a student of philosophy and psychology and those types of liberal arts humanities in college, I'd often wondered about the metaphysical questions, who are we really? What's the nature of reality? Is there a God? And so forth. And I'd often wondered in my kind of earnest yearnings to understand why it didn't feel like I did. And that night in that Bangkok hotel room was my first exposure to a mystical tradition like Buddhism.
For people who are maybe a bit newer into Integral, can you just succinctly, say what Integral brings to your interventions with people as a coach or facilitator or therapist?
Yeah, I think the core value of Integral is it is a way of making sense and making meaning through a range of lenses that if we understand those lenses and who we're encountering in our life, it tells us enough about the human condition that tunes us into cues that we get from others that gives us a sense of where they are. Yes. And when we know where somebody is, we can appreciatively inquire into what's happening for them, what's working, what isn't working. And with the Integral model, because so much of it is developmental as well, we have more of an informed sense of what probable next half steps might look like, knowing that a whole step might be too much. That it's really critical to meet people where they are, to affirm and to validate that.
And when you say half step, do you mean from a developmental level perspective, or do you just mean?
Could be a developmental perspective, but also just in a simple, when any of us face change, I like the expression that, the only thing that really likes change is a wet baby on a good day. It's hard. It's destabilizing. It's upsetting. It's fundamentally disruptive.
Yeah.
And so Integral tries to look at this principle of productive distress not something that's going to be too destabilizing, which sometimes as a change agent, we might be enthusiastic about something that we think is very wonderful and true. But if that's not meeting where somebody else is, then it's a bridge too far. And there's going to be, all sorts of skinning of the knees and road rash from things going awry along the way. So Integral really strives to allow us to have an informed sense of where somebody is and what might be a next baby step on their path.
Yeah.
As well as knowing maybe a whole series, but going one step at a time. Is
there a typical client or intervention for you? Do you notice that there's a common set of patterns that you work with?
I like the Robert Keegan framework that change and growth and transformation is really predicated on an exquisite blend of what we might call support and challenge.
Yes.
Feminine compassion, masculine compassion, how to confirm on the one hand and even disconfirm on the other in the challenge side, and how to bring those together. I've noticed that sometimes in the range of people I work with, all levels of functioning, sometimes I'll ask people how they'd like me to show up. Would you like me to be a caring, nurturing support, a cheerleader, an accountability structure who kicks you in the ass, which a lot of the guys I work with ask me to be?
The ass kicker, yeah.
I can't rely on their report. Sometimes when people say they want me to just be supportive and very gentle and nurturing, they might say after a while, God, all you're doing is asking me how I'm feeling. And they really want to be challenged. And the guys who say that they want me to kick their ass really often need to be held very sensitively. So it's a bit of a mystery. You have to keep reading cues. But my range of clients now is more in the world of I work a lot with business leaders, often in mid-market companies, companies from $10 million to into the low billions. Work with senior executive leadership teams, helping them get aligned. A lot of the work is me helping them with communication skills, how to deal creatively and resourcefully with disagreement and different conflict.
Yes.
How to help them take more larger, expanded perspectives where they're able to, rather than become over-identified with their position, see what their partners, and of course this often morphs into work with their spouses and families and all the rest, But Integral really, I think, as when I think of the usual person, it's more the business world for me these days, but it often morphs into personal life and family work as well.
That makes sense. So if you're using Integral ideas in a coaching or consulting context in the business or corporate world, how do you use them? And do you make it explicit that that's what you're using, or do you just apply some principles and it's going to let the magic happen?
Yeah, there are a lot of principles and frameworks that we talk about that we can mention. For instance, this baby step, next step thing we talk about it as next level leadership.
Yes.
Because Integral, one of the values of Integral is it's a fascinatingly sophisticated meta-architecture that's sufficiently robust to hold knowledge and truth. If you were to talk about it in those ways, that is exciting and fantastic, and bring it on. For somebody else, it's make it stop. Whoa, too much. So, looking at what the optimal degree of simplicity and complexity is for people. So we say, to every complex question, there's a simple answer, and it's wrong. So how to bring in just the right level to find the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So you have to include a little bit of it, but bring it simple enough to be useful and valuable. So we talk about at the individual level the move from being, as we often are, socially defined in the roles that we're in. And a lot of these guys in the business world come in, they have their own ideas. It's often a family business. They're oftentimes dad has told them how to be a business leader, and but with all light comes shadows, so they've got a lot of shadows in that social definition. So we help them make the move from being socially defined to self-authoring.
Yes.
And that is a huge step in its own right. We also talk to them about the move from being compliant on the one hand to collaborative on the other. A lot of these guys do well to learn how to distribute power, decision-making, and to be more collegial and collaborative as leaders. They often get a lot of blowback. We use, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There.
I know the title. I don't know the book well.
It's quite wonderful, by a great executive coach, Marshall Goldsmith. And, he talks about I think the subtitle is something like how successful people can become even more successful. And it's often by undoing the very things
learning.
they're at. Now they have to work at their emotional intelligence, their interpersonal intelligence, as opposed to the table stakes of just mental and cognitive ability that got them to be strategically good planners and thinkers and organizers.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So one of the things you mentioned a little while back was you mentioned Robert Keegan. One of the books that he authored, Immunity to Change. I know that you use some of those ideas around competing commitments and hidden competing commitments in your work. Could you just talk to that a little bit? Because that seems relevant. You said that change is hard, and that is one of the things that gets in the way. But obviously, if they're hidden, people don't even see it. So talk us through that.
Yeah, so much. One of the main integral lenses is what we call the shadow lens. And in terms of change, it's looking at the qualities of ourselves that are aligned to actually prevent for some practical reasons on one level. So when we're working with individuals and organizations who want to make a commitment to real change and what would that would unlock or allow for them, Bob Keegan came up with a simple, great process, which he calls overcoming the immunity to change.
Yes.
And, he begins by looking at the issues people have, what they're frustrated, complaining about, what they want to see happen differently in their lives and their organization's life. So we begin with sort of an appreciative inquiry into the discourse of that frustration. The acronyms that are used are NBC and BMW, and what those mean are nagging, bitching, and complaining, and bitching, moaning, and whining, and this type of thing. So it's playful.
Hyphenated language, yeah.
Yeah, but it gives people permission to actually speak up and express
Absolutely.
what really isn't working. And then what we do from that, the first big move is, how do you mine a complaint, really take from it and unearth the commitment that lives within it, real appreciative inquiry, because we only complain about things we care about. We don't complain about the price of rice in China or something like that. It's what's happening in our lives.
Yeah.
And so we help people identify what it is they're committed to, what they'd like to happen differently. In other words, some people might say, God, I hate the way, if they were complaining, common one is, people talk about each other rather than to each other. There's all this stuff at the water cooler and everywhere, and Joe did this, and Linda did that, and isn't that awful? And, the commitment is, okay, we don't like that, so what we're committed to might be something like clear, direct, straightforward, honest communication. So, okay, yeah, that's something you can stand for other stuff, but I can stand for that commitment.
Yes.
And so people say, yes, that's right, good. Now the next move is, okay, that being the case, we've established that's true. Let's do a little, and this is where shadow gets involved, let's do a little honest reflection and truth-telling. What might you notice that actually goes on that is not in service of that stated commitment of direct, honest, straightforward communication? Because if I look closely at myself, I notice that, even though I have this commitment, I still, when I hear people talking about others, I don't speak up and say, hey, have you tried talking to Joe about that? Or have I tried saying that, this conversation, isn't working for me because, and I might identify what we're doing. Mm-hmm. I also, if I'm honest, know that I actually enjoy gossiping too and talking about Jack over there in Boulder and what he's doing or not doing. So a lot of legitimizing of our shadow with that and being playful with it and just being honest. And so then we have, so we've identified, we have these columns. So there's a column for the complaint, there's a column for the commitment, then there's a column for what we're doing or not doing that may not be in alignment with our commitment.
Yes.
And so that's there. And then we wonder, what's going on? Why do we do those things that are not in alignment? And to make a long story short, like a day-long process, we discover that we actually are committed to other things as well as the straightforward, honest communication. And that becomes a little explanatory. Okay, gee, if I'm committed to that, I can see why I'm getting in my own way and I'm at cross purposes with myself. And then the last big move is looking at the big assumptions that anchor those competing commitments, which are usually security and fear and anxiety based, which are a very real part of our life. And the assumption is, well, if I'm seen as a goody two-shoes or somebody who tries to be better than somebody else, then people won't like me and I'll be rejected. And we allow it to catastrophize all the way out to, and if people don't like me and I'm rejected, then I might lose my job. And if I lose my job, my wife might get upset and I might get divorced. Like you can lay it all that way.
Catastrophic anticipation, slippery slopes. Yeah.
Yeah. And we really entertain these things subconsciously and sometimes quite consciously. And sometimes these things happen. But more often than not, we tell ourselves stories, and the long list is catastrophizing. And we notice that with these competing commitments and big assumptions, there's a lot of mind reading and black and white thinking and a lot of the other cognitive distortions as well. So we try to unearth all those. And then at the end of this whole story, this process, we design what we call safe, modest, recoverable experiments where we see if those assumptions that we're holding as absolutely true might really be just assumptions that may or may not be true. So in designing experiments, for instance, in the one I've been laying out here, I might decide that, well, Jack and I am not very close. We don't trust one another, so I can't go to him, but I know Joe pretty well, so maybe I could go to Joe and ask him about this straightforward, honest communication thing in a very gentle way, making sure I'm not being judgmental, and see if there's a conversation to be had. And then I might learn that, oh my God, I can actually have that conversation. So,
got it.
Anyway, it's just a brilliant process for an appreciative inquiry into the nature of resistance and what we might be able to do to actually take steps toward the commitment that we made. Yeah.
So in terms of your own development as someone who's been in this space for 30 plus years, and you've seen all the models, and you've been to India, and you've seen the stuff from the East, and you've been well immersed in Western stuff and psychotherapy in your own practice, and working with a lot of leading people in the field. What has your attention as like emerging developmental model, or as something that you're really excited about that's coming into the space? How do you stay fresh when there could be the sense of like, well, I saw some of this stuff 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. How not to get either jaundiced on the one hand, or all the ways that could not work. I think there's something about a disposition of a lifelong learner and knowing we're ongoingly a work in progress. I think life also is generous in giving us opportunities to learn by painful experiences. So, still crazy after all these decades now, you can see. And so there's something of fundamental value about continuing to learn and continuing to improve the quality of life, that if we don't continue to learn and transform, there's sort of a stultifying death process that comes in. So I try, like most integral enthusiasts, to be always puppy dog kind of thing, looking for new and exciting ways to make sense of things in different ways. I think it's just a part of the integral mindset to do that.
Yes.
So I continue to be genuinely interested in different ways of making sense. And I do think that, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had it right in As Tears Go By, like we discover new things and think they're new, but in truth, this is all children do that, and we're children relative to the ancients who figured out a lot of the stuff. Some of it really is different and new, but I think it's reinventing and repurposing a lot of old principles in modern and now postmodern and integral ways.
Yes.
But I think it's just wanting to be effective for our own and others' happiness that continues to move me to continue to learn. So there are new models coming out all the time, and I try to stay relatively current. Can't possibly keep up with it all, so I have to be selective. And some of the things, though, that I think are important for an integral practitioner like me is what is that simple yet sophisticated enough. So for me, for instance, one model I love is polarity management. It's really about the shift that's so up for a lot of people between either or thinking and both and thinking.
Yes.
And it's very to see issues and dilemmas in their lives not as problems to solve necessarily by an either-or answer or solution, but as polarities to balance or manage.
Yeah, that's a big shift.
Huge. So for me, it's been finding things like that are what we call sticky, that you can give to people, and right away they have an intuitive apprehension that, wow, that's valuable. That really makes sense. I always thought, boy, should we be giving people unconditional respect, or should our respect be conditional? Well, that's the wrong frame. How do we actually take the upside of both of those and learn what the downsides are if we neglect the other one, which will always come to us if we neglect that whole other side? So that's a huge unlocking move for people.
Yes.
So think things like that as processes, like immunity to change. So I keep looking for those sticky ones.
Yeah, that sounds in the same spirit of sometimes people can take this understanding of unconditional love, and that can get them problematized when they don't see perhaps that there's an aspect of being in intimate relationship with someone which is conditional, because if a certain set of conditions weren't there, you might not want to continue to be in relationship. So it allows people more freedom to kind of be with their experience.
Well, to embrace the other side, let me just say about that one, because it's such a big one, not only in organizational life, but in family life. The common experience I continue to have, let's say I'm working with a couple and they're having parenting challenges. And stereotypically, not always, but generally, you might have a mom who is very sensitive to the struggles and challenges of the child in a way that dad is sensitive to in different ways. So let's say mom is more unconditional in her regard and acceptance and tolerance of a wider range of behaviors. Dad looks at that and says, God, you are so codependent and indulgent of that behavior. You're sort of encouraging it, and yada, yada, yada. And she'll say back, well, who are you to talk? You're a damn Nazi. Every time he does anything, you're punitive and overbearing and harsh and critical. And they're both looking at the downside of their respectively different qualities.
Yes.
And so when they can only see that, a map like this, and there's they start with the upside describing of the upside of theirs. They can do that easily. Then you go to the downside of the other person's, and they can do that easily. But then the map's still there. Then you start inquiring, what might be the downside of yours? And then they're able to start filling in the other pieces. And before long, they've got a whole different vision of what's going on. And so very liberating.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, your website is integralcoach.com. If people want to check out your work, there are some presentations you've given there and some great articles. One of those articles, I think it was for Cosmos Journal, you talked about different types of optimism.
Right.
And I just wanted to dig into that a little bit, because I think you had some distinctions there that could be useful. And you talked about an optimism that you call inspired optimism. I just wondered if you could just say a little bit about what that is, because sometimes what I experience in this space is you've got a lot of people who are very idealistic with their ambitions to have a global spiritual awakening and a love and oneness, and perhaps don't see the importance of the structures of consciousness that need to unfold, and maybe like political and legal structures that might need to be put in place for us to have that one beneficent global consciousness in the world. So what's inspired optimism?
Inspired optimism is one half of what I call an integral optimism. So let me talk about the inspired, because that's the part that I created a whole spectrum after being in so many conversations with people in my world, progressives, integralists, often now calling themselves evolutionaries. So looking at the big picture, what's it about? What are these frightening array of conditions that seem very threatening? And how do we best relate to those? And in progressive gatherings, I noticed I would get the whole gamut of temperament and mindset, ranging from what I called on the one extreme a sort of apocalyptic pessimism with the heartfelt belief that, boy, man and the human condition has done so much to ravage our planet, to despoil it, that anybody who looks closely can see that humankind is a vile kind of blotch on the life condition itself. And we're going to not only blow ourselves up, but all life on the planet. Bad humans.
Yes.
And on the other extreme, you've got what I call a naive optimism. Which imagines that all we have to do is think positive thoughts and be loving and sweet and gentle, and trust that life will take care of us by the nature of life being benign and beautiful and kind and
benevolent universe. Yes.
That whole abundant nature of butterflies and rainbows, And so what I talk about, I've got different zones. That's the extreme zone on both sides. And then there's a moderate zone. And then there are, there's 4 different levels of these things that come closer together. But on the sort of second level of where the moderate zone is, on the side of optimism, it's more than just a cautious optimism, seeing the glass half full. And it's not as idealistic as the more extreme view, which believes that whether it's integralism or liberalism or conservatism or communism or whatever ism it is, Christianity, Buddhism, is going to solve everything if everyone would just believe like us. But inspired optimism says we can look at huge, fundamentally transformative change agents like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or JFK, and we know a lot of their speeches. What they did was imagined with a vision, a possibility that if they were able to really marshal and align resources that are realistic but improbable even, it's sort of like the Goethe quote that providence will move too, that
beautiful.
bold action, there's genius, power, and magic in it. And it's true. Things that seemed improbable, whether it's Reagan saying that, this Iron Curtain's coming down and the Soviet Union's going to collapse. For those of us boomers who are raised with the certainty of that,
what are the chances of that?
Remote, impossible.
How quickly did that happen, really?
Yeah.
A number of years.
It's sort of like the Gandhi quote that I love. He says, first, they ignore you.
Oh, yeah.
Then they laugh at you.
Then they ridicule you, yeah.
Then they fight you. Then you win.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow,
then
it's
they agree
true.
with you, yeah.
Yeah, then they agree, and then you win. But at first you're ignored and ridiculed and then fought because you're a threat to the already existing system. Imagine civil rights, or even back further, Lincoln with slavery. Look at the fight that happened there. Like when it came to that, and then you win, and a whole new reality comes forward. But what inspired optimism knows is that usually it's sort of like in your country when Churchill talked about, sunlit uplands as the upside of overcoming this threat. But there are usually prices to be paid, and inspired leadership knows that too. It's sort of like the recognition. The hero knows there's a dragon, Dragons usually can't be tamed. They need to be engaged and worked through, fought through, and come out the other side. And it's sometimes hard.
Sometimes
it's hard.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because one of the things that I'm
sometimes.
Yeah.
But just on that note, here's what we know about the inspired part of optimism is that when those things happen, when we take new ground and move forward, what we know about evolution and history is that we have been marching steadily forward. It doesn't mean that sometimes it's not 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because it is. But when we look at the amount of goodness, truth, and beauty, is so much more than it used to be at all the earlier epochs, and it's been that way all through history. The nature of you and I exchanging these kind of ideas, living in a benign world like we do, this is a God realm compared to people 100 years ago. Yes. Unbelievable. Kings and queens would die for this life of poverty today, almost.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of evidence that we're on the right track and that there's reason to be hopeful and inspired. But here's the part of Integral that is also a piece of it that I really bring in to complement this inspired faith and trust. Sometimes heroes don't always win. Sometimes the dark forces come over the land, and that's where I talk about the nature of surrender to go with striving. That there are times, and I use, for instance, the example, one of the film clips, I use film a lot in my work, and I use what had been the best-selling film at the time before Avatar, another one of Cameron's films, Titanic.
Yes. Oh, I thought you were going to say Terminator 2. No.
How disappointing. But even that.
It is actually quite sad, though. The first ever CD that I bought was the Titanic soundtrack, so guilty as I stand.
That's beautiful. That was a beautiful soundtrack. But even it's funny you would say Terminator 2 because what we've seen through all great civilizations, Egyptian, Greek, Roman in the West, and all the Eastern ones, those all had to deconstruct and come down, and they though become the fertile ground for new emergence.
Yeah.
It's sort of like Steve Jobs' speech before his death to the Stanford graduating class was all about the perfection of death and the necessity of it.
Yeah.
So I talk about when we look at these problems now, when we look at all the big shifts that have happened in civilization over the course of a history that we're aware of and what we can speculate on, it's necessitated degrees of things coming to an end so that the emergence of new life can come forth. So
yes.
as we presence ourselves optimistically, not as Jack and Bert necessarily, but the spirit that animates us, who we are at the heart of the matter, we're life itself, we're spirit. We have a lot of reason to be hopeful that this is always going to continue on. It always seems to, and it seems to have gotten better and better and better. So if we presence ourselves as we fundamentally are, not as these relative modifications of that, which are also important, we should strive to maintain and improve this lot, but knowing that at some point this too will
pass.
No one gets out of here alive. So there's a whole surrender dimension that comes in with the striving to complement it for a bigger picture.
Yes. So let me ask you, two people you mentioned in the course of that. One was Gandhi, and one was Lincoln. So Gandhi had a philosophy of non-violence, and that violence wasn't to be tolerated in the pursuit of whatever ends. That actually the way is as important, if not more important, than the means. Lincoln was someone who was willing to fight a war over an issue which, as you say, was, and they make this point in the Lincoln film. He's talking about this is to resolve this issue not just for now but for all time. This is for unborn generations. So, who has that right?
Great question. Gandhi was actually inspired by an English poet, Shelley, who wrote a poem called The Mask of Anarchy. And it was about some things that were going on in industrial Europe when people in the, what was the beginning countercultural complaint against the industrialization and the mechanization of man and women in shops and the not very human conditions that were there. There were riots and strikes against that. And Shelley, in this poem, really talked about the nature for the first time of nonviolent resistance and how critically important that was as a way of, in being aligned with what is morally right, you will prevail. And Gandhi took that big time and talked about, you can take my body, you can beat my body, but you can't take my dignity. What they were addressing would be a fundamentally moral and ethical governance structure, where a population, in looking at the harm that is done to innocent people, we can't stand with that. These people are arguing for something that is right and true, and something in us needs to change. So you see people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, when they're facing, for instance, a social system like modern Britain or England or America, fundamentally immoral people who know that some of long-standing ideas and structures and beliefs are in need of reconfiguration, and they can nonviolently take stands. And when they're doing that, when you think of what Gandhi did in that regard, where he says boldly to the British, and you will walk out of here, because the reports back, when the British became heavy-handed, the population at home was aghast in the same way Americans were, and seeing attack dogs at black people in Alabama and Mississippi, like, that is not right. These people just want to drink out of our drinking fountains. Like, we're off course here. Yeah. So the discernment in a change process really does come back to that whole thing of support and challenge in a way. If you think about how we can peacefully just go with resistance as a way of allowing it to naturally deconstruct itself, then that is wonderful. Or, to take arms against a sea of troubles and needing to do that. It's like to everything there is a season, if you will. There's a time to allow, and there's a time to fight and to stand up and do things. And that is what we know in integral terms as, doing the least harm first, always going and trying the option that is going to be as benign as possible. But then if we know that we're taking a stand for what's good, true, and beautiful, marshaling the will to take a rightful stand and going there so that, rather than being victims, we do what we need to be victors in service of the good and the true and the beautiful.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Sounds to me a bit like just war theory, which I think says that, for example, war would always have to be a last resort, but for certain humanitarian needs, it could be it's a kind of necessary evil.
Well, one last thing on that. This is where the work where Howard Bloom is so wonderful. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Is he a Brit?
He is not. He's a Yank in New York City.
Okay.
But he's written books like The Lucifer Principle and Global Brain, and but he looks at reality as requiring, he talks about complex adaptive systems needing elements in it that are conformity enforcers, and on the other hand, diversity generators, and then inner judges and assessors that look at which ones of those need to be operative, giving what survival and thriving mean in a system, and then how to deploy resources. But the principle that's most interesting around this just war thing is whether we're humans struggling against other humans in a different tribe or nation state, or whether we're having what he calls an intergroup tournament, a competition, a conflict with, let's say, an HIV virus had been in conflict with over things, that these conflicts conspire to grow us. We have to be adaptive. We have to innovate in radical ways to survive and prevail. And if you just look at the Second World War, it gave birth to infinite systems and innovations and inventions that allow this whole postmodern reality to be what it is now. Now, we had to pay a huge price for that, and we like to think that that could be done less painfully, and sometimes it can. But if we really orient as largest life, and we look at the nature of Mother Earth with all the storms that come with the sunshiny days, that there's something in its fullness that, just requires us to have a deeper appreciation of the full cycles of birth, sustaining life, and the naturalness of death for what that's worth. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we're about at the limit of our time here today. I've super enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for talking so eloquently on a whole range of things. Is there one thing that you want to either signpost from your work to have people have a look at, or one kind of closing thought that you just want to leave people with as they kind of chew on what you've presented here today?
I've really enjoyed our chat. It's been really wonderful getting to know you, Jack. I've really enjoyed that. I'm always inspired by younger people, younger generations, and your basic intelligence and heart that goes along with a very informed mind, and a lot of reason to be trusting and have good faith about where we're going, challenges notwithstanding, because we certainly have those. But I think the main thing is I do have so much faith in we're going to only continue to improve through the challenge. The work I do, for those interested, I love coaching people, whether it's executives and senior leaders all the way to adolescents. It's just what I'm passionate about, the human condition altogether. So I just feel very blessed to be able to do the work I do in the world, and feel, as this being a part of it, very honored to be part of all the conversations I'm in. So keep up the great work. I love what you're up to.
Well, thank you very much. Well, if you want to connect more with Bert, as I say, his website is integralcoach.com, and you can get his contact details there. And thanks so much for being a guest on the show. We've loved having you, and good luck to you with continuing your work as well.
Thank you so much, Jack. Okay, bye-bye.